start over?
Just keep going.
No, like this is gonna go viral. Like, hi, ladies and gentlemen, and this is our panel. And on my left is Johnny Davis, and on my right is Komal Razak, and my name is Omoshe Asamal, and we are talking about the aftermath of the slave trade and how it affected the continent of Africa. And just a quick introduction to what we're talking about. One of the main things is how Africa got the name Africa, the meaning behind it. And doing the research, I found out two different meanings. One of them is that Africa, like it was from a Roman Latin word, and the adjective of it is afer, meaning black or dark. And another meaning I found is Africa, also in Roman meaning dust. And both of the meanings make sense because they both have the attributes to what Africa is like everywhere you go. There's dust and it's inevitable and stuff. So that's what the meaning of Africa is.
So to start off our panel presentation and leading into our common thread, so many centuries after the slave trade began, the technology was slowly introduced into society and it was started to become wildly used by farmers or people who needed them, therefore meaning that slaves weren't needed as much anymore, meaning that more slaves were becoming free. So now with the problem leading or facing the state was they had a group of unemployed African Americans with nowhere to go or possibly nowhere to work, and a group in 1815 to 1817 an African American by the name of Quark, roughly, and a maritime entrepreneur by the name of Paul Coffey. Paul Coffey had the idea to establish civilization back in Africa where they could eventually send back all the freed slaves. So during this time from 1815 to 1817, Paul Coffey and Quark made a journey to Sierra Leone, where they first helped a small group of African American immigrants to settle there from the States. And this was the goal, to eventually have this, but just on a larger scale, to eventually have all of the free slaves back to Africa at some point. But in 1817, Paul Coffey passed away, but his dream did not die. Shortly after that, a group called the American Colonization Society was formed, and they also had this dream to establish a colony back in Africa to send back all the slaves, so they kind of continued on his dream. And in 1820, they also took their first group of African American immigrants and traveled to a new island off the coast of Sierra Leone called Shreveport Island. But once they got there, the living conditions weren't healthy, so they lost quite a few lives, including some members on the board as well. So they, with the help of the British governor, they were able to relocate to a temporary spot, while they had somebody else to go and search for a better place to relocate the colony. Meanwhile, in the States, the journey back to Africa was optional, so freed slaves were given the option whether or not they wanted to go, and most of them chose not to because they wanted to stay in the land that their ancestors had worked so hard to build. Thus, not that many freed slaves traveled back. And also, the American Colonization Society wasn't completely trusted by the African American slaves because, one, none of the members were of African descent, so they weren't allowing on any free slaves on the board. And two, even though they were claiming to help these slaves, all of the members still owned slaves, and they were all from the southern parts of the states. So and now back to Sierra Leone, while they were searching for land, one of the members ended up coming across a little, well, I guess not colony, but a little settlement that was named at the time, that was named Cape Miserado or Mazzurado, but it was called that by the natives. And with a little forceful persuasion, he was able to attain this little settlement. Then on causing a little colony to move to this settlement, and then they renamed the place Christopolis, which later on went on to be renamed Monrovia. So while these freed slaves stayed in this colonization spot, more and more states and little towns in the states also had this idea of sending more freed slaves back to Africa because they heard news about this settlement and how there's free land around it. So states such as Virginia and Mississippi had smaller groups that had the same idea of sending freed slaves back to Africa, except they weren't an organization like the American Colonization Society, so they worked on a smaller scale. But when they, I guess, transported all of their African Americans back to what is now known as Liberia, but back then just like tiny colony spots spread out over a large area of land. Most of the times these colonies were named after the places they were from in the States, or they were named after an important person or something like that. And eventually, once all these colonies had settled, even though the promise or the goal was that these freed slaves, once they were to arrive at these colonies, were to build their own society and, live a better life, they were still controlled heavily by the American Colonization Society, thus causing a riot. And in 1847, the now formerly known as city known as Monrovia, which was called Christopolis, rioted for their rights, and they codified the laws and established a system and government at that time. And they also fought for their independence. And from that, they were able to name the large land with all these separate colonies to come together and form the country, which is now known as Liberia. And the Christopolis, Christopolis, was then named after President James Monroe. So the capital city of Liberia is called Monrovia. That's where the name comes from. And Liberia itself translates to, I think, the land of the free, I'm pretty sure. And from there on, the government was established, and the governments were established. But after the country was established itself, what these free slaves went through in the States started to happen to the natives. The natives were deprived of their right. They weren't really allowed to basically enjoy the basic rights and freedoms of any, or the large population of Liberian citizens, thus causing a rift between not only the natives and the freed slaves from the States, but also between the tribal natives as well. And which led on, which is probably still going on till now, because shortly after that, the country went into a civil war for a long period of time. And after that, I think it ended around 2000, roughly, or 2004 actually. The first elected president is named Ellen Johnson, and she is not born in Liberia, but her ancestry is Liberian. But she, I'm pretty sure she was born in the States, and she's also the first female elected president of Liberia and possibly of the continent. And after that, she's been governing the country ever since then till now.
Alright, so as we all heard, Liberia was the first country to gain its independence, and soon after, other countries started forming. And before there was only only a couple of countries. But then there was a conference called in Berlin in 1884 to between 1884 to 1885 about the division of the countries, like dividing Africa into countries. But then the European governments only had access to the like outside of Africa, like they didn't have access to the inner part of Africa. So then they came together and decided that they wanted to colonize the countries and divide them among themselves. So European countries owned most of all the African countries, the current countries in Africa, and most importantly, the Great Britain wanted to colonize Nigeria and Ghana because they were the gold coals and they would gain more money from them. And there was also another meeting called to like okay they had to so the meeting, there was a lot of fighting because they all wanted to divide it equally, but some wanted some certain area and the other wanted a certain area because Africa has a lot of riches and opportunities, so that caused a lot of disputes. So that has an effect on the current countries of Africa. And following that, like years later, there was a fight between Nigeria and Cameroon where they were fighting for the petroleum, and that was close to the oil peninsula. And this, they had to take it to court, and happening that the Great Britain owned both countries, they had to find out who had the closer border to Britain to see who was going to win the whole peninsula. And after that, that has had a lot of effects in the current countries, and okay. So around 1950, the European countries started like they started losing interest in the current countries of Africa because African countries started becoming civilized and the people they knew what they wanted for themselves. So they decided that they wanted to gain their independence. So around 1950, most countries gained their independence and started controlling themselves. And when they started colonizing themselves and gained their independence, the Africa was divided into the north, west, east, and south. And basically, the north had where religion was what divided them, like separated them into each. The north are mostly Muslims and the west are Christians and Muslim. But the first religion that first came in was Islamic religion. And when the countries divided, they didn't necessarily divide the countries. The European government didn't necessarily divide the countries into the north, east, and west because, like, it was according to the people's ethnic groups and their religion. They divided it in such a way that they didn't care. They just wanted to divide the countries. So the people that caused war, and people started having fights and they started fighting against each other for their religion. And the common religion back in Africa is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and there's also indigenous religion, which is just like being like an herbalist kind of thing. And So in the north, all of that was common, but the most common was Islamic religion. So people started, when they all started getting their independence, people started moving into the parts of Africa that would suit them the most, that they could relate to the most. But people from the west were moving to the north, and they had to change their religion because they were being persecuted for being a Christian, and they wanted everyone to follow the Islamic religion. And later on, Christianity spread it to the east and in the south, and both religions started. They saw that like they served one God, so then they stopped discriminating against each other, and that's one of the relationships they have with each other. And another thing is that they started seeing that, oh, this person looks like me, this person has this same attributes as me, so then they started going back to their roots, which made them become closer. After that, there was a quote by in the Arab paper that said new rulers in Africa made the decision to keep the borders drawn by former colonizers to avoid disrupting conflict among themselves. So like after they started moving, they realized that, oh, there's no reason for fighting and we're all brothers and sisters, but there's still always that competition to be the better one and the best. And currently there's this group going around the country called the Boko Haram. They're persecuting like other religions, which is like everything is coming back. Everything that happened in the past is coming back to the present to haunt them. But they still believe that they served one God, and I would summarize that the religion is what keeps them together, and not their culture. So, yeah.
So politically and economically, Africa was really bad about it. So because they discouraged more slave trade, and they didn't like encourage the land and the citizenry of the purpose of taxation. So in 15th to 19th century, it estimated that like 12 million Africans were found onto European slave ship, and the effect on Africa were still being felt, and slave trade so politically slave trade is visible in the changes, and it a route to African society. And it subverted the existing political balance in traditional African societies. Slavery became a dominant source, and personal wealth was thought to derive from others. So the negative impact which on Atlantic trade had the political life of African was formation of a class which European created in major slave island, and their intermarriage with some Africans in four Senegalese region includes some of a new African French class emerged at the top of the local political hierarchy that includes local mayors, subordinates, and slave soldiers. These hierarchies of corrupt individuals facilitate